So the evolutionary tree is based on the concept that organisms that share a recent common ancestor will also share many similar structures. And structures that are similar between different species because their common ancestor had that same structure, those are called homologous structures. So I don't love this example. Bat and bird wings are homologous structures. The only part of the bat and the bird wing that is homologous is the bone structure inside the arm. So if you consider the bird wing is the front arm, or the arm of the animal, not the legs, and the bat wing is the arms of the animal, then when you look at the bone structure of the arms, you see similarities. So they both have the humerus, which is this first bone in the upper arm, then radius and ulna, and then the hand structures, the bones of the hand structures. So the inner bone structure of these wings is homologous. Now the covering over the wing, so birds have feathers and bats have just skin that's stretched across, that's not homologous. But if we're just looking at the arm structure, so the arm structure of all the tetrapods is homologous. And I think we saw that arm structure as a good example of comparative anatomy that's presented in chapter 18. But the ancestor had this arm structure. The leg structures also. So on the leg structure you have the femur, which is the big bone of the thigh, and then you have tibia and fibia in the lower leg. So same thing too. But anyway, we're gonna just talk about the inner bone structure of the arm would be homologous. So looking at lots of homologous structures, that's typically how we put things together into cladograms and into evolutionary trees. Now, evolutionary trees incorporate not just the anatomy structures, but data also from genetic data, all kinds of other data types. But all right, but homologous means two, and it's only structures that are homologous. The whole animal, the two animals are not homologous to each other. It's just individual structures are homologous. So in this case, maybe the arms and the legs, are homologous, for example. So the more homologous structures that two species have, the more closely related they probably are. Okay, then you have this other term. It's called analogous structures. Analogous structures are those structures that look similar superficially, but there is not a common ancestor, a recent common ancestor that has the same structure. So here they have the bird wing and the bat wing. The arm structure is similar, but an insect wing, even though we call it by the same name, we call it a wing, superficially it's not at all the same, because an insect wing is not an arm or a leg. It's not it is an appendage, but it's not an arm or a leg. It's another appendage from the body on an insect. And an insect wing doesn't have a bone structure, certainly doesn't have a humerus and a radius and an ulna for the bone structure. There aren't any bones in an insect wing at all. And so even though we call it by the same name, wing, I mean, let's face it, we call a lot of things wings. Even an airplane has a wing, but that's just a failure of the language, I guess, to distinguish. But a wing in an insect is not homologous to a wing of a bird. And the way you know it is, first of all, the structure is not even at all similar. But if you're not sure, if you don't know about the structure, what you would want to look for is there a common ancestor between bird and insect that had a wing? And the answer in that case is no. You would have to go really far back into the evolutionary tree to find the common ancestor of a bird with an insect. And that organism did not have wings. And so I would provide you with the information about what the ancestor had or did not have. And then you would have to make a conclusion about whether or not the structures would be considered homologous or analogous. So I'll provide you with that information regarding what the ancestor would have, because at this point I wouldn't expect you to know what the ancestor, the common ancestor, the recent common ancestor between bird and insect would be, for example. But if I gave you that information, I would expect you to be able to tell me whether or not then the structures are homologous or analogous. All right, so we talked a bit about clades. What's a clade? Clades are defined by what we call derived traits. So derived traits define the clade. The clade could be any group. The group could be a phylum, a class, an order, a family. Any of those classifications are clades. And a monophyletic group means a clade that is where you can, I think we used the example where you can cut the evolutionary tree using scissors, and this is a hypothetical concept, but if you had an actual tree and you cut at the derived trait, you use scissors to cut that branch, everything that falls off, that branch and all the groups that are on that branch are part of the clade, and that's called a monophyletic group, a group that's defined by one trait. Although sometimes it's more than one, but usually we have like a derived trait that is the defining trait of that group. So for vertebrates, if you have an evolutionary tree and you have the backbone, see, this is wrong because vertebrata, lancelet is not a vertebrata. Let me get a pen. All right, lancelet's not a vertebrate, but if the appearance of the backbone is here, and this is the root of the tree, they didn't draw the root, which I dislike, but you have the split. Lancelets don't have a backbone, but the rest of these do, because vertebrae, the backbone appears here. Then if you cut the tree branch here, right here, then all of this would fall off, and that would be the group called vertebrata. And that's a monophyletic group. They all have the same one thing in common. If you, the appearance of the amniotic egg, again, it should be right here. Fish don't have an amniotic egg, so it should be right here. Then if you cut this here, then what would fall off, lizard, rabbit, and human, would all be part of the monophyletic group called the amniotes. All right. So let's practice that a little bit. All right, let's say you had this tree. This represents the root of the tree here. You kind of get used to all different kinds of ways of drawing these trees. All right, so are animals, fungi, and plants, could they be part of a monophyletic group? If you can cut the tree in one place and all three of those and only those three fall off, then yes, it could be a monophyletic group. On this one, could all the flagellates be considered a monophyletic group? Yes, because you could cut the branch in one place and just that group would fall off. What could not be a monophyletic group, what could not be a clade, would be just the ciliates plus the flagellates. Those would not make a single group, because you would have to cut here and here, and that's not monophyletic if you have to make two cuts. Now, if you cut here, then all of this could be a monophyletic group, but you would have to include all of these things, not just the ciliates and the flagellates. And if, could animals and plants be a monophyletic group with each other, but excluding the fungi? No, because again, you'd have to make a cut here and here. And the rule for monophyletic group is one trait that defines everything in that group. So one derived trait for everything. All right, so that's how you can tell whether everything is part of one clade or one monophyletic group. All right, we have a few other things that we need to talk about for the rest of the for this chapter. And what I'm about to tell you is going to probably surprise you. All right, this is called horizontal gene transfer. But let me back up a little bit. Let's talk about vertical gene transfer. Vertical gene transfer is really inheritance. Vertical gene transfer, inheritance. Because if you're thinking about like a family tree, usually you have your grandparents are up here, grandma and grandpa, and then they have a kid, and then they have a kid, and so it goes sort of the transfer of genetic information through inheritance sort of goes down the family tree or something like that. It's called vertical. I guess somebody pictured it vertically. So vertical gene transfer is just inheritance. How you inherit, blue eyes, inheritance. A big nose, small feet, I don't know, whatever you got. You inherit those genes encode proteins, so your cells express those proteins and you get certain traits. Now, that's vertical gene transfer. From one generation to the next, you inherited something from your parents and they inherited it from their parents. All right, so horizontal gene transfer means transfer between individuals who are not, it's not from parent to child, it's from one organism that is alive transferring to another organism that's alive at the same time. This concept has been understood to occur with between bacteria for a long time. I would say, I don't know, 1940s, something along that point. They realized that different bacterial species could transfer genes from one to the other. And that's horizontal gene transfer. But in the 1940s, they said, well, this is something that bacteria do, but we're humans, we're different, we don't do this. Then they started realizing that bacteria can transfer genes to plants. And that was, 1950s, 1960s. But again, they said, well, that's bacteria and plants, we're humans, we're different, this doesn't happen to us. Then, I think you can kind of see where I'm going with this. As they started looking and opening their eyes a little more to some of the evidence, where we are now is, yes, some organisms, even animals, can transfer genes from one to the other. All right, so a gene from a bacterium can transfer to a cell, a human cell. The example that your book gives is that genes from plants transfer to these insects called aphids. So that's plant to animal transfer. I mean, that's fine, but I think it gets more interesting when you talk about the bacteria in your body are transferring genes to your cells. And that's where stuff really starts to get interesting. Now, I don't want to delve too deeply into this. So let's just keep the definitions, let's think about the definition. So vertical gene transfer is just inheritance from parent to child. Horizontal gene transfer, that's where things get interesting. Transfer from organism to organism. And doesn't have to be the same species. It can be bacteria to human, plant to animal. I'm not saying that all organisms do this. I'm just saying there's some, and as soon as we start noticing that some do it, we might, we have to keep our mind open that it might be more common than even that we know right now. So there is evidence of horizontal gene transfer. It's fairly recent of our understanding of bacteria transferring to human. So we still don't know exactly the extent of it, how often does it happen, but we know it can happen. So I think we have to keep our mind open to what this could mean. And this is probably going to create a whole bunch of questions for you. And I don't think I can answer all those questions at this point, and science can't answer them all at this point, but there's a lot of interesting things we haven't figured out yet with this. All right. Now, if animals and plants and bacteria can transfer genes between them, that complicates our understanding of evolution. Because remember, one of our basic concepts of evolution is that mutation creates new alleles, and then those alleles might be favored or not. But what if some of the new alleles come from other species? Then that changes how we look at evolution a little bit, or quite a bit. All right. So that's something we got to think about. Okay. I'm going to change topics a little bit. All right. This is a theory. You might have heard of this before, but if you haven't, you need to know this theory. It's called the endosymbiosis, or the endosymbiont hypothesis, or the endosymbiotic theory. It goes by a lot of names, but endosymbiont is in the title somewhere. What this is a theory, and it's pretty well accepted. I mean, I don't know anybody who rejects this theory in a general sense, that the first eukaryotes probably formed from fusion of two or more prokaryotes. So the idea that these, the mitochondria are actually, nowadays they're just organelles, but way back, about 2.5 billion years ago, these were actually independent bacterial cells living inside of a larger cell. And then eventually over billions of years, they lost their ability to live by themselves, and now they're just organelles. And the evidence, and the nucleus is probably derived from a bacterial cell that got engulfed by another cell. Chloroplasts are believed to be derived from photosynthetic bacteria that lived inside of another cell. So it's a symbiotic. We think that 2.5 billion years ago there were cells that lived inside of other cells in a symbiotic relationship, and that over time the dependence became absolute. And then now what you see as a mitochondria or chloroplast is, just the remnant of those cells that were living inside of the larger cell. And some of the evidence for this is that mitochondria have bacterial ribosomes inside of them, whereas outside of a mitochondrion, you would find eukaryotic ribosomes within the cytosol of the cell. Chloroplasts have bacterial ribosomes inside of them. And also, mitochondria and chloroplasts have their own chromosome that looks very much like a bacterial chromosome. And that chromosome has genes, and it's separate from the chromosomes that are in the nucleus. So that's just a few pieces of information but this is a very well accepted, we still call it theory or hypothesis, but it's, we believe that in some form or fashion it's correct. Now they do argue a little bit about exactly, how the steps might have happened to give you that that endosymbiotic relationship, but that's not important to us. All right. Then there's some other, what I would call more controversial proposals where scientists try to figure out or just kind of speculate on how the nucleus formed, how what we call gram-positive and gram-negative bacteria got their cell walls and such. There's some more controversial theories, but the theory of endosymbiosis is really well accepted. Then we have some models, and again, for these, this is basically kind of a guess. What were the steps of the endosymbiosis? Did a larger cell engulf a smaller cell, and that cell became the nucleus, and then it engulfed a smaller cell, and that became the mitochondrion, or did it go the other direction? Either one of these, to me, we're never going to be able to tell which one of these is right, but I think one of these is right. The hypothesis that I cannot, in my mind, figure out, and therefore I eliminate this as really having any real merit, but you could propose that the eukaryotes were the first cells that evolved, and then I guess they spit out some of their organelles, and those became independent prokaryotic cells. It's too complicated for me, so I think that's not such a viable model. But these first two are really basically just different versions of endosymbiosis. What was the order in which the cells fused together, or not fused together, but engulfed one another. And those are one of those is correct. Are we ever going to figure out which one? Probably not. But when you put everything together, you end up with an evolutionary tree, or a tree of life, that is more complicated. We've been kind of drawing these evolutionary trees as if there's a single root, a single group of cells, and then those diverged, and then those diverged, and so on and so forth. But what's probably more correct, although we are still going to draw our trees kind of according to this simplistic model, is there's a tree called like a banyan tree or a ficus tree, and they have these kind of complicated trunks. It's not just a single trunk, it's more multiple extensions at the trunk. So really the tree of life is probably more like this, meaning you had a group of the initial cells, probably prokaryotes, different fusions, different endosymbiotic combinations of cells led you to slightly different versions of eukaryotes. And then the crossing here would be the exchange of genes horizontally. So the vertical transmission and the horizontal transmission kind of coming together. So this model of how early life formed is probably, even though you don't need to be able to draw this is just an artist's rendition, but this gives you more of a sense of what it's really like. More than one cell probably formed whenever life was first created, which we don't know how that happened, but there was probably more than one different type of cell that formed. Then those engulfed each other in different ways, and as natural selection and some of the other forces of evolution worked, then those diversified, and you ended up with the complicated tree that we have here. And now at the tips of these branches, you have the modern groups of organisms, but the early, the beginnings of it was quite messy in terms of the interactions back and forth. So at the base of the evolutionary tree, it's probably not so nice and neat the way we usually draw it. It's probably more messy, like this banyan tree or ficus tree. The word I'm saying is banyan. I don't know if you know what that is. I spent some time in Vietnam, so it's a common tree that they have there. B-A-N-Y-A-N. So it's kind of this complicated model. All right, so this is probably correct. It's just a more correct view of how the early interactions probably happened. I wish it was nice and neat, but you know, biology can never be that simple, right? There is another model. I don't know if this is significantly different or if it's just another version of the one I just showed you. That there was probably a group of prokaryotes. We don't know. They probably were, you know, the first life probably formed in some different versions. And then from that, spinning off of that would be what we now know as our 3 domains. I don't know that this is really that different than this, because in this case you have this pool of different kinds of cells, primitive prokaryotes, and then ultimately in a messy way spinning out you would end up with these 3 domains. But different concepts. Now, which one's right? We'll never know. I don't think so. Because you just don't have data from 2.5 or 3.5 billion years ago that is going to be absolute. You're working with a small amount of data and then a lot of kind of statistical predictions and such. So it doesn't, you know, in the end it's just more interesting than, you know, we're never going to know probably exactly how things happened. But there was probably a group of different cells at first, you know, somewhat different prokaryotic cells. Probably they combined in different ways, and then at some point you kind of start to see the emergence of the 3 separate domains. So, all right, so that is the end of the chapter 20 lecture.